Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. I think this has been really great so far, and I'm really delighted to be here with you. So I'm going to be talking about something different. I'm going to be talking about what we need to teach. I'm an educator, so I'm focused on what we need to teach. So the overarching question that I want to talk about in the next 15 minutes is, what do we need to learn to flourish in the age of AI? So we're all students. Some of us are going to be teaching others who learn and teaching ourselves. So 3 parts to what I'm going to talk about. The first is about interacting with generative AIs. So I'm focusing just on generative AIs. And then the kind of skills we need to do this kind of interaction, critical creative thinking. And finally, the kind of knowledge, a way to think about liberal arts that fits into what we need to do in the age of AI. So first, interacting with generative AIs. So first, let's get clear on what a generative AI is. You've been hearing about them already, but just to be really, really clear, generative AI refers to a class of artificial intelligence models and algorithms that are designed to create or generate new data, content, or outputs based on the patterns and structures learned from existing data. This is GPT-4's own definition of what it is, basically. So it's not like a regular computer program where it just looks stuff up. It creates it. That's why it's called generative. 2 big classes, large language models, which we just heard about from Dr. Horvitz, ChatGPT, GPT-4, Bard, Claude. There's a lot of them now, actually. And then generative image models. And you also saw examples of that, Midjourney, DALL-E, Stable Diffusion. I expect, by the way, those are going to be combined very soon. They'll just be one kind of system that does both kinds of things. I want to think about generative AIs as cognitive amplifiers. Cognitive amplifiers. So Gen AIs can extend human intelligence. They can augment our strengths. So for example, we're good at telling stories. We're very good at detecting patterns. Can augment those. Can also compensate for our weaknesses. So we have limited working memory. There's only so much we can hold in mind at once. And we have various cognitive biases. For example, we have a lot of weaknesses and strengths. So we need to learn how to use Gen AIs as cognitive amplifiers. That's the focus that I've got. To do so, in my view, we need to learn how to use what I'm now calling a cognitive amplifier loop, the CAL. Now this looks complicated, but it's actually not that complicated. So let me just walk through it. So you start with a goal, something you want to do with AI, say an LLM, a large language model. So for example, it might be you wanted to give a bunch of examples of human cognitive weaknesses. So I asked it to do that at one point. That then leads to a prompt. So a prompt, something you instruct it or request it to do. It does it, and then you have to evaluate it. Notice evaluation is really the core of this here. You have to decide whether it's what you want, and if not, you either are going to revise the prompt. So in this case, when I first asked it for a list of weaknesses, all it gave me were biases. Just biases. That's not what I was looking for. So I revised the prompt, and I asked it, don't just give me biases, give me also structural weaknesses like limited working memory, attentional problems, things like that. So then it prompt ran again, did much better. I decided to refine it. I added a couple that it neglected and some other things, and that was the end of it. In some cases, though, it's really not good enough to refine. So you then revise the goal. So maybe it really wasn't about looking for weaknesses. Maybe what you wanted to know was what the structure of our brains is that leads us to have certain capabilities, different way of framing what the goal is. And you try again. So you have a goal, leads to a prompt, something comes out of it, you evaluate that, you either decide to revise the prompt and iterate, this is the most common thing I've experienced, or it's really bad, you revise the goal and then start over again, or it's pretty good, you exit, refine. So that is the cognitive amplifier loop. So what do we need to learn in order to use this effectively? So this is a structure. This is a way to think about how to organize part of a curriculum. So there are 5 cognitive skills here: setting goals, formulating prompts, evaluating results, revising prompts or goals, and refining products. So using the CAL, the cognitive amplifier loop, the skills required to use the CAL effectively, efficiently, and responsibly. So effectively, so it does what you want it to do, efficiently, as quickly as possible, and responsibly, ethics is part of this, can be defined and honed. This is what part we're going to teach. So, skills. Let's focus on two, critical and creative thinking. So critical and creative thinking. To use the CAL effectively, the cognitive amplifier loop, efficiently and responsibly, we need to learn critical thinking, by which I mean analyzing and evaluating, and creative thinking, by which I mean formulating novel, useful products and processes. So it's not just something new. It's got to be something new that's useful, product and process. Critical thinking, creative thinking. So key insight. Critical thinking is a collection of distinct skills. So I'm going to say there's no such thing as critical thinking. It's not one thing. It's a collection. So here is a taxonomy, 4 types of critical thinking, formulating problems and goals. So we have to identify what the actual problem is, to define and measure the criteria for success, and then there's assessing credibility, so you evaluate whether the source should be believed, whether the argument is sound, the evidence, and so forth. I can't go through all these, we don't have time. But you get the idea. The critical idea is critical thinking is not one thing. We break it down into separate components. And different combinations of these components are going to be relevant at each stage of the cognitive amplifier loop. Creative thinking is also a collection of distinct skills. Key insight, it's not one thing. So in this case, creative thinking is typically organized in terms of 2 big phases. The first is called divergent thinking, where you think of as many possibilities as you can without any regard for whether they're good or not. You just generate away, throw a lot of spaghetti against the wall. So you do that by things like adapting prior solutions to a problem, use analogies, so forth. Convergent thinking is once you've got all these possibilities, you want to winnow them down, narrow them down. So anticipate how effective they'll be, anticipate practical issues like cost and scaling and so forth. I don't have time to go through all this. But critical thinking and creative thinking work together. Critical thinking sets the stage for creative thinking, and creative thinking invites additional critical thinking. So the 2 skills are highly interactive and mutually informed. In fact, a lot of the convergent thinking part is actually critical thinking. It's actually not any different. Divergent is something different. Critical, some aspects are specialized, but some are just general critical thinking, trying to figure out which of the possibilities to adopt. So critical thinking and creative thinking are crucial at every phase of the cognitive amplifier loop, the CAL. Key thing, different sets of constituent skills, those small entries, are relevant at different phases of the CAL. Why do we want to teach this? We can't leave it to Gen AIs to check other Gen AIs. So when I first started thinking about this, I thought, do we need to teach people critical thinking anymore? Or creative thinking? These AIs are pretty good at that. Why not just have one AI check another one? Well, it's not perfect. So then we would check the one that's doing the checking. And how about the one that's doing that checking? It's called an infinite regress. So no, not particularly good ideas. We need humans in the loop here to check the Gen AIs. So humans must learn to guide and evaluate the CAL. The key idea. Humans must learn, it's part of what we're going to teach them, to guide and evaluate the cognitive amplifier loop. So here it is again. You start with a goal, leads to a prompt, an instruction or request. That produces something you evaluate, and then either you revise the prompt, revise the goal, or it's pretty good and you refine it. Let's go through it. So setting a goal. I can't go through all these in detail. I want you to get a sense for it. So you can see there's a set of critical thinking components, like you have to identify what the actual problem is. Define and measure success. How do you know whether it's going the right direction or not? Identify and evaluate biases. That's all critical thinking. Creative thinking. Where do you get the goal from? Well, you can adapt from prior solutions, you can use analogies and so forth. You'll see here, there's more of the creative thinking that's going on than critical thinking for setting a goal. Now what about creating a prompt? Even more creative thinking, because you're coming up with something new. So, evaluating results. Now look, you see there's more critical thinking for evaluating the results, which makes sense, of course. So you'll notice at the end, recognize ethical implications. I think it's really important to keep that in mind. Creative thinking is still important, even in evaluating results. Anticipate, run a little simulation in your head about whether this particular result from the AI is going to be useful. Anticipate practical issues. You have to kind of come up with new things as part of evaluating. And then if you decide you're going to revise a prompt or goal, again, you see there's a fair amount of critical thinking, but there's still a lot more creative thinking that's involved in revising. And finally, same kind of thing with refining a product. So you can see these different components overlap. Some are used a lot, some are used only in very specialized cases. But this is what you need to learn to do. You need to learn to do these aspects of critical thinking and these aspects of creative thinking and learn how to combine them in using this CAL. So let me give you an example. So a goal I had at one point was to illustrate the CAL by creating an active learning exercise. I just finished writing a book called Active Learning with AI, Practical Guide. And one of the illustrations in it, dozens of them, from running AIs and showing what they can do, was to create a debate. So I asked the Gen AI to debate a learner to address a specific learning objective, which actually eventually worked out well. But initially, I ran the prompt, I looked at what I got, and the Gen AI just printed out a transcript of what a debate would look like instead of actually debating. No, thank you. So I revised the prompt, and I told it, don't do that. Don't just print out the transcript. Instead, pause and allow the learner to respond before moving on. And I looked at the new results. So I'm iterating through the cognitive amplifier loop. The Gen AI now printed out, pause and wait for learner after every point it made, without actually waiting for the learner. So then I revised it again, and I said, don't print, don't do this, don't do that. It turns out telling it what not to do is really important, really shapes it up. And finally it did it. It behaved just like I wanted to. We had a great debate. I'm not sure who won. It's probably a coin flip, but it was very responsive. And in this case, there was nothing to refine because it's interactive. In some cases, you make a product, you can design an active learning exercise in advance, in which case, once you have it, you can refine it. But in this case, there was nothing to refine. Okay, so I've been talking about skills. The cognitive amplifier loop is all about getting the AI to do what you want it to do, the kind of skills you need to interact with the AI. But how do you decide what you want it to do? So knowledge and skills are not the same thing. So critical thinking and creative thinking, which is we're talking about, are collections of skills. They're methods, procedures, and processes, things you do. Question, do we also need to teach traditional liberal arts knowledge, like literature, art, history, social sciences, and all that? Do we need to teach that in the age of AI? So Google, Bing, and so on, these search engines, give immediate access to a library that's larger than any encyclopedia, including Wikipedia, which they have access as well to. So given this, why bother? Why should we teach students and have them learn liberal arts when they can just look it up when they need it? I've been asked this seriously, by the way. Some have argued that liberal arts knowledge, philosophy, history, art, and all that, are worth knowing in their own right. This is the knowledge for knowledge's sake idea. Sometimes people talk about furniture for the mind. But that's not what I'm asking here. The question I want to ask is there a practical reason to teach such material? I think the answer is yes. Liberal arts knowledge lies at the core of why we want to use the CAL in the first place. Why we have interaction with AI, why we create particular goals and ask particular questions. Let me show you what I mean by this. However, if this approach that I'm going to advocate is correct, what we choose to emphasize when we teach liberal arts knowledge will probably change. We won't teach it the same way we're teaching it now. Let me explain why. So, I'm going to do an analogy to studying history. At one point, I got interested in what history was for, what historians were trying to do. So I interviewed a half dozen or so very well-known, distinguished historians, really very senior in their fields. And I had lunch with them one-on-one, and they thought I was being social, and I slipped in these questions. So what's history all about? Why do we do history? What are you trying to accomplish? And I discovered some things that just blew me away. I was totally surprised. One was, I always thought Santayana's famous quote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." I always thought that was what drove history. None of them agreed with that. Not a single one. They think about every event is unique and nothing is predictable from what happened before. Santayana, wrong. That was interesting. Second thing was, they don't think about mechanisms of change. One of them told me, this is true, one of them told me as far as he was concerned, the 17th century could be an island off the coast of India right now. Third thing is, they're not interested in discovering general principles. Each event is unique and prediction, according to them, they all said this, impossible. This is Harvard historians, by the way. They're really, really very good history department. So I went home and I thought about this. I was really surprised. And what they seem to be saying, because it was a long conversation with each of them, is my inference, that history is actually about a kind of psychology that is not studied in psychology departments. What they're interested in is human nature. That is the nature of being human. And the key question they all seem to be asking was, to what extent can environmental characteristics and events shape human nature? So think about it. During Germany, during the Nazi era, human nature was different than it is on some Polynesian island. Same genes, just the environment pushes us around. And what they seem to be interested in is what the range of possibilities is to be human. So here's an analogy, the concept of range of reaction in genetics. So most genes don't totally determine how they're expressed phenotypically. Rather, there's a range that then the environment sets you in. So for example, genes bracket the possibilities of height. You're not going to grow to be 10 feet tall as a human being. It's not within the genes. And you probably won't be 2 feet tall either. There's a range. Okay, it's typical. The environment, like nutrition and stress, sets a given person within that range. So here was the idea. Liberal arts can be viewed from the same perspective. They illustrate the range of possibilities for any given student, given the nature of the culture and environment. So social sciences tell you a lot about the nature of culture and environment. They provide direct and indirect experiences to help students understand their own nature. So you don't have to personally have every experience yourself to learn. A lot of our learning is from reading. A lot of it's from reading. So literature, art, history informs you about other people's experience that you can incorporate into your own. You can stand in their shoes, saves a lot of trouble. Okay? It helps you understand more about what the possibilities are to be human. They help students to determine your own personal goals, where they want to be in the space of possibilities. So this is the key idea. Liberal arts are really useful for helping you understand the space of possibilities, what it can be to be a human, and how you personally can situate yourself within that space. So the liberal arts can give students the perspective and judgment to use the CAL, the cognitive amplifier loop, effectively and as well as responsibly. Setting good ethical goals, so ethics are clearly part of what you learn in liberal arts. It helps students prioritize what's most important when planning and evaluating, which affects how they interact with the CAL. This in turn guides the process of refining what the AI produces. So, perspective and judgment. Liberal arts can help students interpret data. So the data becomes information. And then they can help you put that information into context so it becomes knowledge. And finally, if done really well, you can view knowledge in a broader perspective so it becomes wisdom. Liberal arts can do that, and I can't think of something more practical and useful for dealing with AI than having knowledge and wisdom. So to summarize, we need to learn the cognitive amplifier loop and related ways of interacting with Gen AIs. To do that, we need to teach students the skills necessary for critical thinking and creative thinking so we can use the CAL effectively, efficiently, and responsibly. Breaking them down into components, realizing different combinations of components are important in different phases of the CAL. And finally, broad knowledge of the liberal arts through the lens of what we know, of what we need to know to use the CAL appropriately so it actually helps us and it helps the species, humans, to flourish in the age of AI. That's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, we will have Q&A session. 자, 슬라이드에 올라온 질문들 읽어보겠습니다. Now, there is a concern that relying too heavily on AI tools without guidelines could actually hinder critical thinking and creative thinking competencies. When guiding students on the use of AI tools, what should educators keep in mind?
Well, nothing is perfect. Nothing is perfect. And it's a moving target as well. These AIs keep being updated and so forth, and there's, of course, randomness built into the algorithm, so it may not behave the same way twice when you do it, so when you use it. So it is up to us to filter and put the results in context and decide what to do with them. And in order to do that, we need to have the critical thinking and creative thinking to use these products. We're not going to get it just from the machines. Okay, in terms of diversity, is there anything that learners should keep in mind when using AI, considering that the data used by AI ultimately creates standardization derived from learning data? Very good point. Excellent point. Yes, it's true. These AIs were trained on huge amounts of data, but there are biases built into them. So this is yet another argument why human users need to learn to be critical thinkers. They don't just accept what the things do. You have to look at it from a broader perspective, which can be set through studying liberal arts, so that you can know what to take seriously and what to trust, and what needs to be taken more skeptically. Let's see, was there any other question there?
In terms of diversity, is there anything that learners should keep in mind when using AI, considering that the big data used by AI ultimately creates standardization diverged from the learned data?
If not, we can save some time here, and I'm happy to let us move on. So thank you all very much.